A ranch in Utah has been under investigation for almost 30 years, and nobody involved has been able to close the file. Not local police, not a private research team, not the Pentagon. Compare that to Roswell, which got wrapped up in a government explanation within weeks of the story breaking. This ranch never got that clean ending, and the reason isn't that nobody looked. It's that the people who looked the hardest with real funding and real instruments are the ones still saying they don't have an answer. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what those scientists recorded and why a program buried inside the Defense Intelligence Agency spent years quietly paying attention to this one patch of land. Start with the basic shape of the place, because it's almost aggressively ordinary. 500 acres of high desert scrubland in Utah's Uinta Basin, a ranch house, some outbuildings, cattle fencing. If you drove past it, you wouldn't look twice. That plainness matters, because it means whatever drew serious money and serious scientists here wasn't the location's looks. It was what kept happening on it. The Uinta Basin itself is already a strange piece of geology, known to researchers for unusual natural gas, seepage, and dense, complicated mineral deposits underground. That's not folklore. That's on record with geologists who study the region for reasons that have nothing to do with mysteries. Oil and gas companies have drilled here for decades purely for the resources, long before anyone attached a mystery story to the land. So before a single strange story ever gets told, this land already sits on top of something physically unusual. In a basin, geologists were already mapping for entirely separate reasons. Here's the part that separates this ranch from basically every other haunted land story you've ever heard. In 1996, the property was bought outright by a research organization called the National Institute for Discovery Science, founded by aerospace and hotel businessman Robert Bigelow. He didn't buy it to flip it or run cattle. He bought it so a team of scientists could live there full-time and document whatever was happening, using actual equipment, cameras, magnetometers to track magnetic field changes, radiation detectors, motion sensors. Nobody funds a live-in scientific team on empty land for years unless something already earned that level of attention. What earned? It was decades of reports from the families who lived there before the sale. This is where the story gets uncomfortable, so it's worth slowing down. In Navajo tradition, a skinwalker is a malevolent figure, a witch able to shift into animal form. Among the Ute and neighboring tribes, this exact stretch of land has long carried a warning. This is ground that doesn't want people settling on it. That's not campfire invention. It's a real, serious part of indigenous spiritual belief, and plenty of native communities have said they're uncomfortable with how casually pop culture throws the word skinwalker around for entertainment. Whatever you think about what comes next, that cultural weight deserves respect, not a punchline. This isn't a story that started with a scientist or a TV crew. It started with people who lived on and around this land for generations, long before anyone brought in a magnetometer, the ranching family that lived there. Before the sale had compiled, and in many cases filmed, a long list of things they said they witnessed. Cattle found dead with wounds veterinarians on site called surgically precise, but with no blood anywhere at the scene. That's the well-known phenomenon of cattle mutilation, reported on ranches across the American West for decades, and still without a fully agreed-upon explanation, even among the vets who've studied it closely. Lights moving over the property at night, and patterns witnesses said didn't match any aircraft or drone they knew. Large animal tracks that appeared in fresh snow and then just stopped. No trail leading away, like whatever made them lifted straight up. Family members described a constant feeling of being watched, sometimes with a physical pressure strong enough that they wouldn't go into certain parts of the property after dark. Let's be completely fair about what category those specific stories fall into. They're witness testimony. Nobody independently verified the mutilations or the lights as anything beyond what individual people described seeing. That explains a lot of similar haunted ranch stories you've heard before, and it usually explains why the trail ends there, but it's what happened next at this ranch that makes it different. Because instead of staying personal testimony, this became the subject of a genuinely funded, methodical scientific investigation. When the National Institute for Discovery Science took the property over, the team included physicists, a biochemist, and former military and intelligence personnel experienced in running controlled field experiments. This wasn't a ghost hunting show with handheld cameras and spooky music. It was closer to a stakeout, run with lab-grade equipment. Infrared cameras ran continuously. Magnetometers watched for shifts in the local magnetic field. Motion-triggered recorders sat at multiple points, so any single event could theoretically be caught from more than one angle at once. According to accounts later published by team members, including a book written by one of the lead researchers, they did record real anomalies over their years there. Sudden, brief spikes in the magnetic field with no source anyone could find. Equipment across multiple independent devices failing at the exact same moment. Footage of lights and moving objects the team couldn't identify using known aircraft, wildlife, or weather. Now here's the honest part, and it's the part most retellings skip. Some of what got recorded has a completely normal explanation, and the researchers themselves have said so. Ball lightning, a rare, real atmospheric electrical phenomenon, can produce glowing lights that look genuinely alien to someone who's never seen it. The basin's unusual underground gas and mineral makeup could plausibly explain some of the electromagnetic hiccups and equipment failures. Distant aircraft and simple misidentification account for a lot of unexplained light reports in any remote area, not just this one. Researchers on the original team have openly admitted a chunk of what gets discussed online as skinwalker phenomena probably has a mundane, if unusual, natural cause. That explains part of it. But here's what it doesn't explain. A smaller set of specific recorded events did not fit any explanation the team could construct, even after they ruled out equipment error, weather, wildlife, and human interference. Most of it explainable, a residue that isn't. That's the honest version of this story, and it's actually the more interesting one, because it means this mystery isn't built on exaggeration. It's built on a narrow, stubborn gap that real data couldn't close. That gap is exactly what pulled in people well outside a private research institute. In 2007, a Department of Defense program called the Advanced Aerospace Weapon System Applications Program, AAWCP for short, was quietly funded through the Defense Intelligence Agency. Bigelow's aerospace company won the contract to run it. Among the sites that program investigated, according to information that later became public, was this exact ranch. That's not a rumor pulled from a forum. The program's existence, its funding, and its tie to Bigelow have all been confirmed through official channels, and it later became part of the wider public conversation about the government's interest in what's now officially called UAP, Unidentified Aerial Phenomena. Reporters who covered the program's disclosure described it as one of the first times a modern administration publicly acknowledged funding this kind of research at all. Stick with this next part, because it's the piece most people never actually sit with. Scientists connected to that program and related government efforts have since gone on record, in interviews and in congressional testimony, describing encounters with technology and phenomena they couldn't explain with known physics or known adversary capabilities. That happened in official testimony, not a podcast, not a forum post, in front of Congress. More recently, under new ownership, the ranch entered a public phase of research, partly documented through a long-running TV series. Whatever you think of a show made for entertainment, it's ended up as one of the more consistent public records of a science team returning season after season with better equipment each time. Across those seasons, the team has reported equipment malfunctions they couldn't trace to normal causes, ground-penetrating radar picking up underground anomalies nobody's identified, and repeated encounters with lights and aerial objects that, in their accounts, didn't match any aircraft or drone they knew. It's worth being precise about who these scientists actually are, because loose language is where these stories usually drift from fact into hype. The people involved genuinely hold credentials in physics, aerospace engineering, and defense research. Some genuinely have military or government research backgrounds. That part is real and checkable. What isn't real is a peer-reviewed scientific consensus confirming paranormal activity at the ranch. That doesn't exist, and no credible scientist involved claims it does. What they actually say, consistently, is narrower than that, and more credible, because it's narrower. A persistent minority of what they've documented with real instruments over real years still doesn't fit any physical model they currently have. That's a very different claim than the ranch is haunted, and it's the one worth paying attention to. So why here and not one of the thousands of other ranches across the American West? Researchers have floated a few theories, and it's worth walking through them honestly, weaknesses included. The first is geological. The Uinta Basin sits on an unusually dense mix of natural gas, oil shale, and minerals, and some geologists think specific underground conditions here could generate localized electromagnetic effects, maybe even faint light, similar to the still poorly understood earthquake lights recorded elsewhere before seismic events. The theory is grounded in real, measurable geology, and it's the explanation most scientists reach for first, because it doesn't require anything exotic. But it doesn't explain reports of structured, controlled seeming lights or mutilation patterns that look less like a random glow and more like something deliberate. A shimmer in the sky is one thing. A precise, bloodless wound is a different problem entirely. The second theory, favored by some researchers with defense and intelligence backgrounds, is that whatever's happening reflects genuinely advanced non-human technology. Extraterrestrial, or some category current science just doesn't have a box for yet. That's an extraordinary claim. And by any normal scientific standard, it needs extraordinary evidence that publicly doesn't fully exist yet. But it's also a claim now being taken seriously enough by people with real security clearances that it's shaped actual government funding decisions, which is a completely different situation than a theory that only lives on enthusiast forums. A third, quieter theory, and one responsible researchers raised themselves, is psychological and environmental. A mix of rare, real phenomena, the isolation of remote desert land, decades of pre-existing cultural narrative about the area, and ordinary human pattern seeking under stress, could have combined to blow up a small set of genuinely strange data points into a much bigger mythology than the evidence actually supports. That theory doesn't require anyone to be lying. It just says humans are extremely good at building a coherent, scary story out of a handful of real oddities, especially on land that already carries centuries of cultural warning. None of these three theories fully closes the case. And that, more than any single dramatic anecdote, is the actual mystery. This isn't a story where nobody bothered to look closely. It's a story where a well-funded, methodically serious, government-connected research effort has looked closely, repeatedly, for almost 3 decades, with better instruments every year, and still hasn't produced one clean, conventional explanation for everything on record. Sit with what that convergence actually means, because it's easy to skim past. Most cursed land stories anywhere in the world run entirely on personal testimony passed down through retelling, with zero controlled instrumentation and zero institutional interest beyond entertainment. This ranch is nearly alone in attracting sustained, well-funded, credentialed scientific attention, specifically because what was being reported was considered significant enough to justify it. First, a private institute staffed by scientists and former intelligence officers. Then an actual Department of Defense program. Now an ongoing, better-equipped civilian research effort that keeps coming back to the same unanswered question. Governments don't usually fund classified research into a location because of ranch folklore. Something in those early reports, whatever its real cause, was compelling enough to justify real institutional money and real institutional time. Government reports have acknowledged in careful bureaucratic language that a genuine subset of investigated cases stays unresolved even after ruling out the normal explanations. None of that proves any single dramatic theory, but it does mean the honest current state of things is this. A real research effort exists, a real unresolved data set exists, and real people with real security clearances are on record saying they don't have a full explanation. Now put the whole picture together, because that's where this story actually earns its weight. A specific patch of land sitting on unusual geology, already carrying centuries of indigenous warning to stay away, bought specifically for scientific study instead of entertainment, investigated for years with real physical instruments by credentialed scientists and former intelligence officers, folded into an actual classified Department of Defense program. And after almost 30 years of steadily better attention, still leaving behind a residue of documented events nobody's fully explained with known physics, known geology, or known technology. Any single piece of that, taken alone, has a normal explanation. Misidentification covers plenty of the sightings. Local geology probably covers a chunk of the equipment failures. Ball lightning likely explains some of the glowing lights on its own. But all of it together, stacked across 3 decades and 3 separate waves of serious investigation, funded by a billionaire, then a federal agency, then an ongoing research team, is a very different kind of question than one spooky story around a campfire. The scientists who've spoken publicly about their time there are, for the most part, careful people. They're not claiming certainty. The more credible ones are upfront about the uncertainty instead of trying to sell you a conclusion. What they say over and over is close to this. After years of instrumentation, after ruling out the explanations that would normally close a case like this, a narrow, repeatable gap remains. That gap is exactly why the research never stopped in almost 30 years. It's why a private institute turned into a government program, and why that government program eventually turned into public testimony in front of officials whose entire job is to be skeptical. Maybe the real story here isn't a monster in the dark or a ship overhead. Maybe it's simpler, and in its own way stranger, that after decades of real money, real scientists, and real government interest, one ordinary-looking piece of Utah desert still hasn't been fully explained, and the people whose whole job was to explain it are the first to admit they're not done. If a ranch that plain could pull in that much attention and still keep its secret, that's exactly the kind of case worth following. This channel goes looking for the files the official record itself admits are still open. If a 500-acre Utah ranch can quietly outstump the Pentagon for 30 years, that's the kind of unresolved case this channel exists for. Subscribe, because we're back every week with the next file nobody's closed, and there's a second Uinta Basin site connected to this one we haven't covered yet, coming next.